Hey guys, I'm here on my front porch and we're going to walk through Romans 11 today. But before we do, I wanted to give you a quick rundown of some of the things that hopefully you've heard StoneBridge is doing so you can get more involved during this time. But number one, if you are a man, check out in the email from last week, hopefully again this week, you'll see a link down there to the men's reading plan. So check that out from Josh. I'm excited about that. Join in with us. Go through that. It's going to be great. For women, there is the women's Bible study. Again, the link should be in the email. And then for children, we have weekly updates. So I would encourage you, check out the website, check out the links to the page, find a way to get plugged in and stay connected with us at StoneBridge during this time. But with that said, today we are in Romans 11, and we're going to pick up right after Josh left off in Romans 10. So Josh talked a little bit about God last week having a plan for salvation that was extending beyond Israel, beyond Judaism, and the idea that all of the salvation was meant for the entire world, Jew and Gentile. And here we get into chapter 11. So I'm excited about going through this with you. Here's how this is going to work. I'm going to ask you to pause in just a moment, and when you do, you'll read through the verses I give you. I want you to just do a quick preliminary read. I'm going to give you some things to consider, some ideas, some thoughts, and then I'll have you pause again and dig back in and talk about those together. Then once we get done with each section, we'll just move on chunk by chunk. But all in all, this should be a pretty quick thing. I'd recommend either doing it all at once in about 30 minutes, or you can split it up into 3 or 4 days if you and your spouse or friends or whoever you're doing this with. Hopefully you're doing it with somebody. Community is good for a Bible study. Just want to take it bite by bite. But here we go. We are on chapter 11. We're going to look through verses 1 through 10. So I want you to go ahead and pause, and I'll be back with you in a second. But pause and look through verses 1 through 10. All right. So we're back after reading verses 1 through 10. And Paul picks up on this idea, right, that salvation is for all. And he asked this question, and he says, so then has God rejected the Israelites? Has he rejected the Jew? And rather than teasing this out, rather than leaving this open-ended, he gives this immediate, hearty, and just really resolved no. It's emphatic. No. But I want you to pay attention in this because Paul uses the word hardening as he goes through his argument. And this word hardening has a lot of connotations theologically. So I want us to kind of divorce ourselves from a lot of the theological arguments that use the word hardening. And I just want you to stop and give 10 seconds to consider this. How would you define the word hardening? To do this, I'm going to ask you to pick up a synonym. Just pick one synonym for hardening. And then I want you to just think about how you would explain that. But I'm going to give you 10 seconds starting now. Go ahead, get that word. We're almost there. 3 seconds. All right, hopefully you have a word. It wasn't too hard. I just want you to think on that word, and I want you to ask this simple question. If you were to reread that, and you may need to pause and do that, how would you explain what Paul is arguing? You see, a lot of times hardening talks about this idea of God rejecting, right? God hardens the Pharaoh's heart, therefore God rejects, predetermines, predestines the Pharaoh to hell or damnation. And the question we have here is that Paul is explicitly talking about this hardening not being tied to a divine rejection. So I chose the word solidify, right? Because if I'm hardening, my thought, my idea, whatever it is, it's gaining substance, it's gaining a foundation, it's growing density, it's solidifying. So I just want you to take a moment. If you need to reread through 1 through 10, do it. But what is the implications here of God hardening the hearts of the Jews? So go ahead, take a moment. Once you guys are ready, we will jump into part 2. All right, part 2. This is going to be verses 11 through 24. And I want you to go ahead and read through this. But as you read through it, I want you to pay special attention to 2 things. Number 1, I want you to pay attention to the idea of stumbling here, because Paul's going to talk about the stumbling of the Israelites. And number 2, I want you to pay attention to the word jealousy here, or jealous. But go ahead and pause it on me now, and read verses 11 through 24. All right, so hopefully you have paused and read verses 11 through 24. We'll talk a little bit about stumbling and this idea of God either causing or allowing Israelites to stumble. And I hope you picked up on this idea that this is not God causing, but God allowing. In fact, we'll actually pick up more on this as the argument continues. But the big one I want us to think through is jealousy, because jealousy is really a word that has a negative connotation for us, right? We're not to envy. We're not to be jealous. But yet we hear things like our God is a jealous God. And we see right here that Paul wants the Jews to be jealous. So my question for you to consider is real simple. How would you define this jealousy? Maybe there's a pop culture reference you have. Maybe there's a simple explanation, but I want you to take a few seconds and think through how would you define Paul's argument with jealousy here? All right, you got 10 seconds. Almost there. All right, so here we go. Hopefully you have at least some thought on jealousy and how you would explain this. If not, you're welcome to pause and collect your thoughts. But I used the kind of idea of Shine from the Newsboys, the old song. Remember, Shine, make 'em wonder what you got, make 'em wish that they were not on the outsides looking in. Now, you guys are in for a treat when you hear me sing because I'm nearly tone deaf. But in that song, and I absolutely love this, he has that idea, make 'em wish that they were not, right? He's talking about this idea of seeing something different in us. Maybe it's a morality, maybe it is charity and love and grace and goodness, but there is something in your life, some way that the gospel has moved you and transformed you that makes others wonder what you got, and they want it too. And this, I think, is the heart of Paul's idea of jealousy here. And so one of the quick questions I want us to reflect on, and just a challenge for us in general, is, are we living out the gospel in a way that makes our neighbors jealous? I know that wording may sound weird for us today, but this is the idea. Does it make them want to be invited in? And if the answer to that is no, then I really just, before you go on, I want you to pause and pray and think through that hard. But as we go on through part 2, we have one final issue here we need to walk through, and that is this. Hopefully you picked up on this idea that as Paul defines his argument, he's talking both about God's grace, yet simultaneously he talks about God's justice or his judgment. Maybe the word was severity. And I want you to stop and think and ask yourself, are these two competing ideas or character traits, God's justice, God's severity, and his grace, or do these somehow work in tangent? Do they work together? Are they compatible? If so, I just want you to think through that and make an argument for it. So you and, again, your spouse, you and a friend, just you by yourself, talk out loud, but think through this idea. Paul is putting these two together. So what do you think it means that he is both a God of grace, yet a God of severity, a God of judgment, a God of justice? And how do these two then begin to help us define each of those terms? All right, and guys, we are finally on when you're ready to part 3. If you need to pause it, go ahead and pause and you can finish up part 2. But part 3 is going to pick up with verse 25 through 36. If you need to pause and just read through that real quick right now, go ahead. Otherwise, we have a few things we can talk about because we're going to zero in on Israel's salvation. So go ahead and pause now, pay attention to Paul's argument, and we're going to talk through. All right. Hopefully the rocking has not distracted you. It has helped provide me with a pace. But, and this is the big one, we are zeroing in on Paul's understanding of Israel's salvation. And he starts to use some really cool ideas and some really complex ideas here. So the first one you're going to see is in verse 28. If you need to pause and reread 28, do that now. But I want you to think about this. He actually defines our relationship and God's relationship with Israel or with the Jews in 2 ways. Hopefully you picked up on what those are. If not, he actually calls them enemies, but he also calls them beloved. And what I want you to think of is this simple idea. What does it mean that there are enemies of the gospel, yet simultaneously that these same enemies are beloved by God? So take a moment, talk to somebody else on that, or talk out loud, whatever you need to do. And I'll be right here when you're done. Just go ahead and hit pause. All right. So hopefully you thought through that a little bit. This is a leading question for me, mostly because we're talking about the Jews in verse 28. But I would challenge just to say that I think this carries over to any non-believer today. I mean, maybe they're seeker sensitive and they're not necessarily enemies of the gospel, but the truth of the matter is our world is hostile to certain biblical and gospel concepts. And war for the gospel does not mean conquering or conquest by beating down. It means winning over. And just, I want us to think through how we treat others as beloved, even while we see them necessarily sometimes as enemies of the work of the gospel. So with that said, jump into verse 32, give it a quick read, and go ahead and pause right now and glance that over. But again, that was verse 32. All right. So hopefully you read over verse 32 again. I just want you to collect your thoughts on this, and it's simply that Paul uses the word consigned, right, or to give over. What do you think it means that God consigned us to evil? And he gave us over to evil. And how does this work with verse 28 and the way that we should treat people? So put those two together. There are enemies of the gospel, but they are beloved by God. Yet God has allowed all of us to be consigned to evil, that we may see his grace. Just take a moment to think about what that looks like on a tangible level, to love your neighbor, to share the gospel with your neighbor. But go ahead and pause me now, talk through that, and once you guys have your thoughts out, I'll be right here. All right. So guys, we are going to move on into the summary. So this is kind of the final moments for us together. I've enjoyed prepping this way. It's really helped me, I don't know, just kind of put out some food for thought, hopefully, and not necessarily just lecture. But with that said, I do want to summarize kind of what we talked about today and then leave you with one final question. And here we go. First, we said this, that the solidifying of the heart is not divine rejection, right? The hardening of the heart is not necessarily divine rejection. That sometimes God will solidify someone's heart, and that's what he chooses to do. I think that's a hard concept for us, but maybe he solidifies it in a good way. He gives us resolve to trust in him. And then there are times where he solidifies us to watch us walk into the consequences of our action in the hope of repentance, or in the opportunity of repentance. Number two, our response to an unbelieving world today is to shine, right? It's to make them jealous. It's to make them wonder what we got and make them wish that they were not. This is, I think, the kind of core concept that Paul's getting at when he talks about the gospel spreading. And we would even go on, this is not novel to us, we would go on and actually argue that the way people come to Christ is not through intellectual argument, it's through one-on-one relationships. And that's what Paul's talking about. And that challenge to us is still there. Do we live a life that actually challenges our friends, our neighbors, our family members to dig in and get to know God? Number three, enemies of the gospel are still beloved by God. So conquering is different than simply going to war. 3b, and this is a big one that I think was emphasized, but I'm going to put my own words on there. Paul talks about this idea of being shown grace. And I would argue that if we have enemies of the gospel that are beloved by God, we have to remember that we have been shown grace that we may show grace. So I want to encourage you, as we are locked in, sheltered in place, as CV-19 apparently picks up for another month, that you have patience and love and kindness as we spend a lot of time with people who are close to us and close quarters. But show grace. Number 4, here we go. Verse 36 is kind of Paul's big declaration at the end of the chapter, and I absolutely love it. I'm going to summarize it this way, but I'd encourage you in a moment to go back and reread it. All people were created by God. They are sustained in and through God, and now they are being called back to God. This verse, this declaration to me, embodies both a biblical worldview and the Great Commission, right? Everybody was created by God. Orientation, skin color, political views, whatever you want to argue, everyone was created by God. We are alive only by the grace of God, and we are sustained only by the goodness of God. And now that the gospel has come to life, now that Christ has come to earth, and God has revealed himself, all of humanity is being called back to God, and we are to participate in that. So here's my fifth point of summary, my final question for you to consider. In the midst of being locked into our houses, limited interaction, trying to build connections, how can we live out that declaration? How can we show our loved ones that they were made by God and are only sustained through God? And how can we help voice that they have been called back to God? So that's my thoughts for you today. This has been Romans 11. I know the video has been a little long, but man, I miss you guys. I look forward to seeing you again soon, and I hope that this time has been a little restful for you, and not just stressful as society changes. But I will see you in a couple weeks, and I look forward to seeing next week's lesson. Feel free to drop us a line. Again, check out the website, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.